The iron rim of the wagon wheel struck a hidden rock beneath the slush, sending a violent jolt through the wooden bench that rattled Clara Leving's teeth. She did not make a sound. She had learned. Over the last 300 miles of mud and misery, that sound invited attention. And attention was a currency she could no longer afford to spend. The wind in this high country was not like the wind in the valley. It was a living thing, a predatory beast that hunted for gaps in her woolen shawl and bit at the exposed skin of her neck with teeth made of ice. It was the winter of 1878 in the Montana Territory, a place that seemed to Clara less like a geography and more like a purgatory carved from granite and pine. Micah, the man holding the reins, spat a stream of brown tobacco juice over the side of the wagon. It landed on the pristine snow, a dark stain spreading like a bruise. He turned his head, his beard crusted with frost, and leered at her. "Almost there, girl," Micah shouted over the howling wind. "Bitter Creek. End of the line for you, and payday for me." Clara stared straight ahead, fixing her eyes on the ears of the lead mule. She was 22 years old, though she felt 100. Her father, the Reverend Thomas Leving, had preached fire and brimstone every Sunday, thundering about the debts of sin. But in the end, it was not spiritual debt that had killed him and doomed her. It was the very literal debt of gambling tables and whiskey bottles. He had died of a burst heart in a brothel in Helena, leaving Clara nothing but a legacy of shame and a promissory note held by men like Micah. They had told her the debt had to be cleared. They had told her there was a market for women in the camps where men forgot what a soft touch felt like. They called it an auction. Clara knew it for what it was. It was a slaughter. Only the animal was left breathing. The wagon crested a ridge, and the town of Bitter Creek revealed itself below. It was a scar on the landscape, a huddle of rough-hewn timber buildings clustered around a muddy thoroughfare that looked more like a hog wallow than a street. Smoke rose from crooked chimneys, flattened instantly by the wind. Even from this distance, the place smelled of wet wood, unwashed bodies, and desperation. Micah drove the wagon down the slope, the brakes screeching in protest. As they entered the main street, men stopped their work to watch. They were hard men, trappers wrapped in buffalo hides, miners with skin stained permanently by earth and ore, drifters with eyes that had seen too much and forgotten too little. They watched the wagon pass with a hunger that made Clara's stomach turn to stone. She lifted her chin. She would not give them the satisfaction of seeing her tremble. If she was to be sold, she would stand tall. She was a Leving, even if that name meant nothing but ruin now. Micah pulled the mules up in front of a structure that served as both a saloon and a general store. A crowd had already begun to gather, drawn by the rumor of fresh blood. Men stood on the boardwalks, leaning against the rough posts, their breath steaming in the frigid air. "Get down," Micah ordered, swinging himself off the seat. Clara moved stiffly. Her limbs were frozen, her boots thin and cracked. She stepped down into the mud, which sucked instantly at her ankles. A circle formed around her, tight and suffocating. The air smelled of stale beer and aggressive masculinity. A man stepped out of the saloon. He was wide, wearing a bowler hat that looked ridiculous atop his fleshy, red face. This was the auctioneer, a man Micah had called Silas. He looked Clara up and down as one might inspect a horse for glue. "She is thin," Silas muttered, though his voice carried, "But she has all her teeth." "Micah?" Micah laughed, a harsh, grating sound, all her teeth and a fire in her belly. "She is a preacher's daughter, Silas, clean as new snow." Laughter rippled through the crowd. Clara felt the heat rise in her cheeks, but she kept her face mask still. She locked her hands together beneath her shawl to hide the shaking. "Let us get on with it," Silas shouted, clapping his gloved hands together. "The wind is picking up, and I have whiskey waiting." He gestured for Clara to step up onto an overturned crate that had been dragged into the center of the mud. It was a pedestal of humiliation. Clara hesitated for a heartbeat, her pride warring with her reality. Micah took a step toward her, his hand raising, and she moved. She stepped up onto the crate. From this height, she could see them all. There were 30 or 40 of them. Their faces were a blur of beards and grit, but their eyes were distinct. Some were cruel. Some were empty. Some were merely curious. She looked over their heads, fixing her gaze on the dark, jagged line of the tree line halfway up the mountain that loomed over the town. "Gentlemen," Silas bellowed, his voice fighting the wind, "what we have here is a rarity in these parts. A woman of breeding, a woman of youth. She comes to satisfy a debt, and the highest bidder takes the prize. She cooks, she sews, and I am told she reads the good book. If you have a need for saving." More laughter. A man in the front, missing an ear and smelling of rot, stepped forward. "Does she warm a bed?" the man shouted. Micah grinned. "For the right price. Skinner. She will warm whatever you want." Clara felt a scream building in her throat. A hot, jagged thing, but she swallowed it down. She would not cry. She would not beg. She turned her gaze from the mountains to the back of the crowd. That was when she saw him. He stood apart from the others, leaning against the corner of the livery stable. He was a mountain of a man, taller than anyone else in the crowd by half a head. He wore a coat made of heavy bear fur, the hide worn and seasoned, and a wide-brimmed hat pulled low. His beard was dark, thick, and threaded with premature gray, hiding the lower half of his face. But it was his stillness that caught her. The other men were twitchy, loud, constantly moving to keep warm or to assert their space. This man was as motionless as the pines. He was watching her. His eyes, shadowed by the brim of his hat, were unreadable, but they did not leer. They held a weight, a gravity that pulled at her. He looked like a piece of the wilderness that had decided to walk into town and judge humanity. $5, a voice shouted. It was Skinner, the one-eared man. "I have 5, Silas called out. "Do I hear 10? $7 and a winter's supply of venison," another man yelled. He was young, with wild eyes, cash or dust. "Boys," Silas admonished, "I cannot drink venison." $10, a miner shouted from the back. The bidding was slow, painful. Every number was a measurement of her worthlessness. $10, 12, 15. The price of a good rifle. The price of a mule. Clara felt a strange detachment, as if she were floating above her own body, watching this girl on the crate be bartered away. Skinner stepped closer, his hand resting on the knife at his belt. $20, and I will take her now, the crowd murmured. $20 was a significant sum in a town where a man could be killed for his boots. Silas looked around, rubbing his hands together. $20 going once. Look at her, gentlemen. She is sturdy. She will last the winter. Clara looked back at the man in the bear coat. He had not moved. He had not spoken. Why did he not look away? Why did he force her to endure his witness? $25, the miner shouted again. $30, Skinner roared, turning to glare at his competition. I said 30. And the next man to bid against me loses his tongue. Silence fell over the circle. Skinner had a reputation. Clearly, he turned back to Clara, a triumphant, gap-toothed grin spreading across his face. He looked at her as if she were a meal he was about to devour. $30, Silas said, sounding disappointed but resigned. $30 going once, $30 going twice. Clara closed her eyes. She prepared herself for the touch of Skinner's hand. She prepared herself to fight, to bite, to scratch, to die if she had to. She would not go easily. 50 ounces. The voice was low, a rumble like distant thunder. But it cut through the wind and the murmurs like a blade. Every head turned. Clara opened her eyes. The man in the bear coat pushed himself off the wall of the livery stable. He walked forward, the crowd parting for him instinctively. Men stumbling over themselves to get out of his path. He moved with a fluid, predatory grace, silent despite his size. Silas blinked, his mouth hanging open. Did you say $50? Sir, 50 ounces, the man repeated. In gold. A collective gasp sucked the air out of the street. 50 ounces of gold was a fortune. It was enough to buy the saloon, the stable, and perhaps the sheriff, too. It was a king's ransom. Skinner's face turned a violent shade of purple. "Who do you think you are? Boone? You cannot just walk in here and—" The man, Boone, stopped. He stood 6 feet from the crate. He did not look at Skinner. He did not look at Silas. He looked only at Clara. Up close, his eyes were the color of slate, hard and impenetrable. There was a scar running from his temple into his hairline, white against weather-beaten skin. "I bid 50 ounces, Boone said. "Do you have a counter? Skinner?" Skinner's hand twitched toward his knife, but his friends grabbed his arms, pulling him back. He spat on the ground, cursing, but he did not bid. No one could match that. Silas was trembling. "Sold. Sold to Elias Boone for 50 ounces of gold." Elias Boone did not smile. He reached into his coat and withdrew a heavy leather pouch. He tossed it to Silas. It landed with a heavy, dull thud in the auctioneer's hands. Silas scrambled to open it, peering inside, his eyes widening as the dull glint of heavy dust and nuggets confirmed the claim. "It is all there," Elias said. He stepped up to the crate. Clara braced herself. She expected him to grab her arm, to haul her down, to claim his property with the rough entitlement the others had shown. She glared at him, pouring all her hatred, all her fear, into her eyes. "Touch me," she thought. "Touch me and see that I am not broken yet." Elias did not touch her. He stood before the crate and offered a slight nod, a gesture of almost formal politeness that was jarringly out of place. "Come," he said. His voice was gravel, unused to speech. Clara hesitated, then stepped down. Her legs nearly buckled from the stiffness, but she caught herself. She would not fall at his feet. She followed him. He did not look back to see if she was there. He simply assumed she would be. He walked past the stunned crowd, past a fuming Skinner, past a grinning Micah who was already counting his share of the auction money. Elias walked toward 2 horses tied near the livery. One was a massive black gelding, the other a sturdy roan mare with a high-backed saddle. He untied the mare and held the reins out to Clara. "Can you ride?" Clara stared at the reins. "I can ride," she lied. She had ridden only side saddle on gentle ponies in her youth, not mountain horses in a freezing wilderness. "Get on," he said. Clara struggled into the saddle, her skirts bunching around her legs. The cold leather bit through her thin dress. Elias mounted the black horse in one fluid motion. He turned his horse not toward the saloon, but toward the thick timberline that marked the edge of civilization. They rode in silence. The town fell away behind them. The sounds of the auction replaced by the rhythmic crunch of hooves on snow and the rising shriek of the wind. The sky above was turning a leaden gray, heavy with the promise of a storm. Clara watched his back. He was broad, his shoulders tense. Who was this man? Why pay a fortune for a wife and then treat her with this cold distance? Was he saving her for something worse than Skinner? Her mind raced with terrors, each more gruesome than the last. They rode for an hour, climbing steadily. The air grew thinner, sharper. The trees grew denser, towering pines that blocked out the remaining light. Just as Clara felt she could not endure the cold for another minute, the trees broke, revealing a small clearing nestled against the sheer face of a cliff. A cabin stood there. It was built of thick logs, chinked with mud and moss. A stone chimney rose from one side, dark and cold. A lean-to shelter was attached to the back, where firewood was stacked high. It looked solid, a fortress against the wild. Elias dismounted and came to her horse. For a moment, she thought he would reach up to pull her down. Instead, he stood by the stirrup, his body blocking the wind, waiting for her to dismount on her own. Clara slid down. Her legs were numb. She stumbled, and his hands shot out to steady her, gripping her elbow. His grip was iron hard, but he released her the instant she found her footing. "Inside," he said. Clara pushed open the heavy wooden door. The cabin was dark and freezing, colder inside than out. It smelled of pine resin and solitude. There was a single room, a cot in the corner covered in furs, a table with 2 chairs, a cast-iron stove. It was sparse, clean and undeniably masculine. Elias followed her in. He did not take off his coat. He moved immediately to the stove, opening the iron door and stuffing in kindling and wood with practiced efficiency. Within moments, a fire was roaring, casting flickering orange light against the log walls. Clara stood near the door, hugging herself. She did not know what to do. Was this when he would demand his due? Was this when the monster would reveal himself? Elias stood up and brushed the bark dust from his hands. He turned to face her. In the firelight, his face was even more rugged. The scar on his temple pulled slightly at the corner of his eye. He reached into the inner pocket of his coat. Clara flinched, stepping back until her shoulders hit the door. Elias paused. He looked at her cowering form, and a shadow of something, pity, annoyance, crossed his face. He slowly withdrew a folded piece of heavy parchment. He took 2 steps toward her and held it out. Clara stared at the paper. "What is this?" she whispered. Her voice was raspy from the cold and hours of silence. "Take it," he said. Clara reached out with a trembling hand and took the paper. She unfolded it. The light was dim, but she could read the bold script. It was a deed to 160 acres of land, including the cabin and the timber rights. She scanned down the page. Her breath hitched. At the bottom, where the owner's name should be, the name Elias Boone had been struck through. Beside it, in fresh, wet ink that had barely dried, was written, Clara Leving. She looked up at him, her mind reeling. "I do not understand." Elias looked past her, toward the window where the snow was beginning to fall in earnest. "You are a free woman, Clara Leving," he said. His voice was rough, devoid of sentiment. "I bought the debt. I paid the price. This land, this cabin, it is yours." Clara shook her head, the paper rattling in her hand. "Why? Why would you do this? You paid 50 ounces of gold." "Because," Elias said, looking at her directly for the first time since the auction, his eyes intense and unyielding. "No one should be owned." He turned away from her and walked to the corner of the room. He picked up a canvas pack that was sitting on the floor, already fully loaded. He threw it over one shoulder. He grabbed a rifle leaning against the wall. "There is wood in the box," he said, moving toward the door. "There is dried meat in the cellar beneath the floorboards. The river is a 1/4 mile south if you can break the ice." He put his hand on the latch. "Wait!" Clara cried out, the shock giving way to a sudden, frantic panic. "Where are you going?" "Away," Elias said. "But you cannot just leave me here. I do not know how to survive here. I do not know how to chop wood or shoot a bear." "You will learn," he said, "or you will go back to town when the weather clears and sell the land. It is worth enough to get you a ticket to the coast." He opened the door. A wall of white slammed into him. While they had been inside, the weather had turned with the violent suddenness of the mountains. The wind was shrieking now, a banshee wail that drowned out Clara's protest. Snow was driving horizontally, a blinding curtain of ice. Elias stood in the doorway, looking out. He swore softly. A low, harsh sound. He pushed against the wind, trying to step out. But the horse, the black gelding he had left tied to the rail, whinnied in terror, rearing up and pulling at its tether. The roan mare was already huddled against the cabin wall, shaking. It was a whiteout, a true Montana blizzard. To ride into this was suicide. Even to walk a mile to the nearest shelter would be a death sentence. Elias stood there for a long moment, his hand gripping the doorframe until his knuckles were white. He looked at the storm. Then he looked back at Clara, who was standing by the stove, clutching the deed to her chest, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and confusion. He slammed the door shut and latched it against the gale. He dropped the pack from his shoulder. It hit the floor with a heavy thud. Elias did not look at her. He walked to the stove, removed his gloves, and held his hands out to the heat. "I cannot leave," he said, his voice flat. "Not tonight." Clara swallowed hard. She looked at the bed, the single, narrow cot in the corner. She looked at the man who filled the room with his sighs and his silence. She looked at the deed in her hand. the paper that said she was free, even as the storm trapped her with the man who had bought her. She retreated to the far side of the table, putting the solid wood between them. "I will sleep on the floor," she said, her voice trembling but determined. Elias looked at her over his shoulder. His eyes drifted to the cot, then to the rough puncheon floorboards where drafts of freezing air whistled up from the cellar. "Take the bed," he said gruffly. "I will not." "Take the bed. Clara, I have slept on granite harder than this floor." He pulled a buffalo robe from his pack and spread it on the floor near the fire, but not too close to her. He sat down, leaning his back against the log wall, his rifle across his knees. He tipped his hat down over his eyes, effectively ending the conversation. The hours stretched out, marked only by the howling of the wind and the crackle of the fire. Clara did not move for a long time. Finally, exhaustion overcame her fear. She sat on the edge of the cot. She did not undress. She kept her boots on, her shawl wrapped tight. She lay down, facing the wall, her back to him. The cabin was small. Even with the wind, she could hear him breathing. It was a steady, rhythmic sound. She clutched the deed in her hand, the paper crumpling slightly. "You own this land now," the words echoed in her mind. He had spent a fortune to set her free, and now he sat guarding her from the storm like a sentinel. Clara lay awake, staring at the rough grain of the logs, her heart hammered against her ribs. She was terrified of the storm, terrified of the future, terrified of the man breathing 6 feet away. But beneath the terror, there was something else, a burning curiosity, and a strange, unsettling realization that for the first time in her life, the man in the room with her had not asked for anything. Elias Boone lay awake too, his eyes open beneath the brim of his hat, watching the firelight dance on the ceiling. He listened to the storm, trying to tear the roof off the cabin he had built with his own hands. He listened to the shallow, frightened breathing of the woman in his bed. He felt the weight of the gold he had spent, and the heavier weight of the deed he had surrendered. He had meant to be gone. He had meant to save her and vanish, a ghost doing a good deed to pay for old sins. But the mountains had other plans. The fire popped, sending a shower of sparks up the chimney. Outside, the snow buried the world, sealing them in together. The silence between them was thick, heavy with unspoken questions and the ghosts of the pasts they both carried. It was going to be a long night. The storm that had sealed them inside the cabin lasted for 3 days. When it finally broke, the world had been remade in blinding white. The snow drifted high against the windward wall, reaching nearly to the roofline, and the silence that lay over the valley was absolute, broken only by the occasional crack of a pine branch giving way under the weight of the ice. For Clara Leving, the end of the storm meant the beginning of a different kind of survival. She had expected Elias Boone to ignore her, or perhaps to order her about like a servant. Instead, he treated her with a terrifying, relentless practicality. He did not speak of the deed, or the gold, or the future. He spoke of the immediate mechanics of staying alive. On the first clear morning, he placed a heavy Henry rifle in her hands. It felt cold and greasy, smelling of gun oil and spent powder. "Hold it up," Elias commanded. They stood in the small clearing in front of the cabin. The air was so cold it burned the lungs, turning every breath into a cloud of fog. Clara struggled with the weight of the weapon. Her arms, thin from months of poor rations and stress, trembled. "It is too heavy," she said through gritted teeth. "It is exactly as heavy as it needs to be," Elias replied. He stood 10 feet away, his arms crossed over his chest, watching her. "Lean into it. Tuck the stock against your shoulder, right in the pocket. If you do not hold it tight, the recoil will break your collarbone." Clara gritted her teeth and pulled the wood against her shoulder. She sighted down the barrel at a dead stump he had pointed out across the clearing. "Squeeze," he said. "Do not pull. Squeeze it like you are wringing out a wet cloth, slow and steady." She fired. The crack was deafening, shattering the morning stillness. The stock kicked her shoulder with the force of a mule, and she stumbled back, nearly dropping the rifle. The bullet went wide, taking a chunk of bark off a pine tree 5 yards to the left of the target. Elias did not scold her. He merely stepped forward, took the rifle, levered another round into the chamber, and handed it back. Again, he said. This became their rhythm. By day, he dragged her into the realities of the mountain. He taught her how to read the snow for tracks, showing her the difference between the frantic scuttle of a hare and the heavy, purposeful drag of a wolf. He showed her how to set a snare line in the brush near the creek, his large, scarred fingers moving with delicate precision as he twisted the wire. Watch the path, he told her, kneeling in the snow. Animals take the path of least resistance. Just like men, you set the trap where they feel safe. Clara watched him more than she watched the snare. She was wary, her instincts honed by years of navigating the tempers of volatile men. She waited for the mask to slip. She waited for him to demand payment for the food she ate or the wood she burned. But the demand never came. He was distant. Yes, he spoke little, and when he did, it was only to instruct. But there was no cruelty in him. It was a confusing, maddening absence. Inside the cabin, the lessons continued. The cast-iron stove was the heart of their existence, and Elias taught her its moods. Pine burns hot and fast, he explained, handing her a split log. Good for boiling water quickly, but if you want to sleep through the night without freezing, you need hardwood. You bank the coals. You feed it like a living thing. If the fire dies, the cold comes in, and up here, the cold does not forgive. Clara learned to listen to the fire, to know by the sound of the draft if it needed air or wood. She learned to skin the rabbits he brought in, her stomach churning at the warmth of the blood, but her hands growing steadier with each attempt. Yet, the silence between them at night remained a wall. They moved around each other in the small space like two planets in orbit, careful never to collide. Clara slept on the cot, and Elias slept on the floor, a loaded revolver always within arm's reach. One evening, 2 weeks after the auction, the wind picked up again, rattling the door on its hinges. The fire was roaring, casting long, dancing shadows against the logs. Elias was sitting at the table, cleaning his knife with a rhythmic scraping sound that had become familiar. Clara sat on the edge of the bed, mending a tear in her skirt with a bone needle he had given her. She stopped sewing and looked at him. The question had been burning in her throat for days, a hot coal she could no longer swallow. "Why?" she asked. The scraping stopped. Elias did not look up. The firelight caught the silver threads in his beard and the deep lines etched around his eyes. "Why what?" he asked, his voice low. "Why did you give me the land?" Clara pressed. Her voice was stronger than she felt. "You paid 50 ounces of gold. You could have bought a herd of cattle. You could have bought this whole valley. Instead, you bought me. And then you gave away the only thing of value you had to show for it." Elias set the knife down. He picked up a whetstone and began to run it along the blade, the sound softer now, like a whisper of steel. "I did not buy you," he said. "I bought a debt." "There is a difference?" "Not to the world," Clara said bitterly. "To the world. I was a purchase." Elias looked up then. His eyes were dark, reflecting the flames. He looked at her for a long moment, studying her face as if reading a map of difficult terrain. "I saw you standing on that crate." He said, "So did everyone else." Clara countered. "Skinner saw me. Micah saw me. They saw a woman they could use. I saw your eyes." Elias said. He paused, searching for the words. "You stood there with your chin up, but your hands were shaking under your shawl. You looked tired." He went back to the knife, running the stone along the edge with a slow, deliberate motion. "You looked like you had never been given anything without a price," he said quietly. "Like you expected the blow before the hand was even raised." The words hit Clara like a physical strike. She sucked in a breath, the air suddenly thin in the room. It was a truth she had never spoken, never even fully admitted to herself. Her father's love had been conditional on her obedience to his strict, twisting theology. The creditor's mercy had been conditional on her silence. Every interaction she had ever known with a man had been a transaction. a barter where she was the currency. To hear this mountain man, this stranger with violence in his hands, speak the deepest truth of her life was unbearable. She stood up abruptly, the needle dropping from her lap. "You do not know me," she snapped, her defense mechanism flaring. "You do not know what I have been given or what I have paid." Elias did not rise. He did not argue. He simply nodded, accepting her anger as he accepted the weather. "Perhaps," he said, "but the land is yours, and there is no price on it, no rent, no favors. It is just dirt and trees. Clara, but it is yours." He blew the dust off the blade and sheathed it. The conversation was over. Clara turned her back to him, facing the dark corner of the room, tears pricking her eyes. She hated the tears. She hated that his kindness hurt more than Skinner's cruelty. Cruelty, she understood. She knew how to harden herself against it. But this quiet, demanding generosity left her unmoored, floating in a space where she did not know the rules. The next day, Elias went out early to check the trap line further up the ridge. He told her to stay inside. The air was bitter, and the snow was crusty and treacherous. Left alone, Clara felt the cabin closing in on her. She needed to move, to do something that felt like agency. She looked around the room. It was a bachelor's den, functional, cluttered, and dusty in the corners. She set to work. She found a granddaddy broom made of bound twigs and swept the floor until her arms ached, pushing out the dirts and pine needles that had accumulated over months. She heated water and scrubbed the grease from the table. She reorganized the shelves where the tin plates and cups were stacked, arranging them by size. As she moved a stack of canvas sacks near his bedding roll, she knocked over his pack. The contents spilled out: a spare box of ammunition, a coil of rope, a small leather-bound Bible, and a small, battered tin box. The tin box popped open as it hit the floor. Clara knelt to gather the items. Her hand hovered over the contents of the box. Inside lay a single, faded photograph. It was an ambrotype, the image captured on glass, encased in a velvet-lined frame. She knew she should not look. It was an intrusion, a violation of the fragile truce they had built. But her hand moved on its own. She picked it up. The image was ghostly, the edges darkening with age. It showed a woman, seated, with a serious, pleasant face. Her hair was pulled back severely, but her eyes were kind. On her lap sat a small child, perhaps 3 years old, a blur of movement as if the boy had turned his head just as the shutter clicked. Clara stared at the woman. There was a resemblance to Elias. The same strong jaw, the same set of the brow. His wife? His sister? She heard the crunch of boots on the snow outside. Panic spiked in her chest. She quickly shoved the photograph back into the tin box, snapped the lid shut, and shoved everything back into the canvas pack. She pushed it back against the wall, her heart hammering against her ribs. When Elias opened the door, bringing a gust of freezing air with him, Clara was standing by the stove, stirring a pot of beans, her face flushed. He stomped the snow from his boots and entered, carrying 3 brace of rabbits tied by their hind legs. He hung them on the hook near the door and turned to the room. He stopped. His eyes moved over the swept floor, the organized shelves, the clean table. He looked at the small sprig of evergreen Clara had placed in a jar of water on the windowsill, a tiny spot of color against the gray logs. Clara held her breath, gripping the wooden spoon. She had changed his space. She had imposed herself on his sanctuary. Elias looked at her. For a second, she thought he might be angry, but his shoulders, usually held high with tension, seemed to drop an inch. "It looks good," he said. He walked to the basin to wash his hands. That was all. But to Clara, the silent acceptance was a victory. She had staked a claim, not with a deed, but with a broom and a branch of pine. That night, the tension that usually strangled the air seemed to loosen. They sat at the table, the candles flickering between them. The stew was hot, flavored with wild onions Elias had dug up from the cellar and dried sage. Elias tore off a piece of hardtack biscuit and soaked it in the broth. "I once saw a man try to ride a moose," he said, apropos of nothing. Clara blinked, looking up from her bowl. "A moose?" Elias nodded, his face serious, though a glint appeared in his eye. Up near the Canadian border, he was a trapper named Frenchy. Claimed he could break anything with 4 legs. Said a moose was just a horse with a bad temper and funny horns. What happened? Clara asked, a small smile tugging at her lips. Well, Elias drawled. Taking a bite of the biscuit, the moose took offense. It ran straight into the lake. Frenchy stayed on for about 10 seconds. The water was freezing. When he came out, he was blue and the moose was halfway to the other shore. Frenchy claimed the moose cheated because it knew how to swim better. Clara laughed. It was a rusty sound, startled and sudden. It felt strange in her throat, like a muscle that hadn't been used in years. Elias watched her, and the corner of his mouth twitched upward beneath his beard. It was the first time she had seen him almost smile. The sound of her laughter seemed to push the walls of the cabin out, making the space feel larger, warmer. For the first time, they were not captive and captor, or debtor and savior. They were just 2 people eating a meal while the winter wind prowled outside. But the world outside did not intend to leave them in peace. 3 days later, the sun broke through with a deceptive brilliance. The snow dazzled, blindingly bright. Clara was outside, hacking at a layer of ice on the water barrel. When she heard the sound of a horse approaching, she froze, the hatchet in her hand. Elias was around the back of the cabin, splitting wood. A rider emerged from the tree line. He was a man made of grease and leather, riding a shaggy mountain pony that looked as mean as its master. He wore a coat of wolf skins, and his face was a map of grime, centered by a nose that had been broken more than once. A long rifle was scabbarded at his saddle. He pulled the pony up 10 yards from Clara. He looked her over, his eyes lingering on her figure beneath the heavy wool coat. He grinned, revealing teeth stained yellow by tobacco. Well now, he said, his voice a scratchy wheeze. I heard old Boone had bought himself a fancy piece in town. The rumors did not do you justice, girl. Clara tightened her grip on the hatchet. She stood straight, channeling the cold stillness Elias had taught her. This is private land, she said. You are trespassing. The man laughed. A wet, hacking sound. Private land. There is no law up here. Girl, just what a man can take. He swung his leg over the saddle horn and slid to the ground. He dropped the reins and took a step toward her. I am Jeb Calloway. I trap this creek. I have been trapping this creek since before you were born. Boone thinks a piece of paper changes that? He took another step. Clara raised the hatchet. Stay back, she warned. Calloway sneered. Or what? You will chop me with that kindling stick? Put it down. Honey, maybe I will show you what a real man looks like. Boone is half ghost anyway. He reached for her. There was a blur of motion from the corner of the cabin. Elias did not shout. He did not run. He simply appeared, stepping between Clara and Calloway with that terrifying silent speed. He held his splitting maul in one hand, the heavy iron head resting easily at his side. Get on your horse. Calloway, Elias said. Calloway jumped back, his hand flying to the pistol at his belt. Elias did not flinch. He did not raise the maul. He just stared, his gray eyes devoid of anything human. This is my water. Boone, Calloway spat. Though he did not draw his gun, I have traps set all the way to the ridge. Not anymore, Elias said. This deed is legal, and you know the rules. You pull your traps, or I pull them for you. Calloway's eyes darted between Elias and Clara. He saw the size of Elias, the heavy maul, and the absolute lack of fear. He licked his lips. You think you can play house up here? Calloway sneered. You, with your blood. You think God forgets? Elias' jaw tightened, the muscle jumping beneath his beard. The scar on his temple turned a stark white. Leave, Elias said. The word was a stone dropped into a deep well. Calloway spat on the snow near Clara's boots. I'm leaving, but this ain't over. Boone, you watch your back, and you watch her. Pretty things break easy up here. He mounted his horse, gave Clara one last, stripping look, and wheeled the pony around, disappearing back into the trees. Elias stood watching him go until the sound of the hooves faded. He did not look at Clara. He turned and drove the splitting maul into a stump with a violence that shook the ground. "Go inside," he ordered. That night, the peace of the dinner was gone. Elias paced the small cabin, a caged animal. He checked the window shutters 3 times. He checked the load in his revolver. He checked the bar across the door. Clara sat on the bed, watching him. The fear she had felt for Calloway was replaced by a deeper fear of the energy radiating from Elias. "Turn down the lamp," he said abruptly. Clara blew out the flame. The cabin plunged into darkness, save for the dying embers in the stove. Elias sat on a stool by the door, his rifle across his lap. He was waiting. It was past midnight when the sound came. It was not a knock. It was the sound of something heavy dragging against the logs of the back wall, where the firewood was stacked. Then, the smell of smoke. Not wood smoke, the acrid, oily smell of burning pitch. "He is trying to smoke us out," Elias whispered. He moved. He did not open the front door. He moved to the small, low window on the side of the cabin, the one that faced the lean-to. He unlatched the shutter with agonizing slowness. Clara pressed herself against the wall, her hand over her mouth. Elias slid through the window like smoke. He was gone into the night. Clara scrambled to the window and peered out into the darkness. The moon was behind clouds, but the reflection of the snow offered a ghostly illumination. She saw a flicker of flame near the back of the cabin. She saw the silhouette of a man, Calloway, pouring something from a jug onto the logs. Then she saw Elias. He came out of the shadows not as a man, but as a force of nature. He did not fire his gun. He tackled Calloway, hitting him with the force of a falling tree. The jug flew into the snow. The 2 men rolled in the drift. Calloway screamed, a high, thin sound that was cut short. Clara saw the flash of steel in the moonlight. Elias's knife. It was not a fight. It was a dismantling. Elias was on top of him. He slammed Calloway's head into the frozen earth once, twice. Calloway flailed, trying to bring his own knife up, but Elias caught his wrist and twisted it with a sickening crack. Elias raised his knife. The blade caught the moonlight. He held it there, poised to plunge it into Calloway's throat. "Elias!" Clara screamed from the window. The sound of her voice seemed to freeze him. The knife hovered inches from the trapper's neck. Elias was panting, his breath coming in white, ragged bursts. He looked down at the man beneath him, then up at the window where Clara's pale face pressed against the darkness. He snarled, a sound of pure animal rage. He grabbed Calloway by the collar and hauled him up. "If I see you again," Elias hissed, his voice carrying through the cold air, "I will not stop. I will skin you and nail you to the tree line as a warning to the wolves." "Do you understand?" Calloway scrambled backward, sobbing, clutching his broken wrist. He did not answer. He scrambled to his feet and ran, stumbling and falling in the deep snow, fleeing toward where his horse was tethered. Elias watched him go. He stood there in the snow, the knife still in his hand, his chest heaving. He looked wild, terrifying, a creature of violence. He turned and looked at the cabin. He looked at Clara. When he came back inside, he did not speak. He barred the door. He went to the stove and shoved wood in, his movements jerky and uncoordinated. His hands were shaking. Clara watched him. She saw the blood on his knuckles, Calloway's blood, or his own. She saw the way his eyes were wide, seeing things that were not in the room. The rage was fading, leaving behind a hollow, devastating wreckage. He sat down on the floor, his back against the door, and dropped his head into his hands. The knife lay on the floor beside him. Clara moved. She slid off the bed. Her bare feet were silent on the wood floor. She walked across the room until she was standing in front of him. "Elias," she whispered. He did not look up. "Do not," he rasped. "Do not look at me." Clara knelt. She reached out. She hesitated for a heartbeat, remembering the violence she had just witnessed, the lethal efficiency of his hands. But then she remembered the deed. She remembered the clumsy way he had tried to make her comfortable. She remembered the woman in the photograph. She placed her hand on his trembling hand, the one resting on his knee. Elias flinched as if she had burned him. His whole body jerked, pulling back, but he did not pull his hand away. He froze, trapping his breath. His skin was rough, cold from the outside air. Her hand was small and pale against his scarred knuckles. "I am not afraid." She lied. Or perhaps it was not a lie. Perhaps the fear was there, but it was outweighed by the recognition. He turned his hand over slowly, until his palm was touching hers. He did not grip her fingers. He just let the contact exist. "You should be," he whispered, lifting his head. His eyes were wet, rimmed with red, filled with a haunting, ancient pain. "You should run from me." "Clara, I am done running," she said softly. They sat there on the floor in the dark, the firelight dying down, the smell of violence and winter clinging to his clothes. They said nothing else, but in the silence, the dynamic had shifted. He was no longer just her savior, and she was no longer just his burden. They were two wounded things in the dark, tending to the fire so the cold wouldn't win. The thaw came to the Montana high country not as a gentle awakening, but as a violent breaking of the winter's spine. The silence of the snow was replaced by the roar of the river, swollen with meltwater, and the constant dripping percussion of icicles surrendering their grip on the cabin eaves. The valley floor turned into a slurry of mud and surfacing granite, but beneath the brown sludge, the first tenacious shoots of green began to push through the earth. For Clara Leving, the spring brought a similar resurrection. The hollows in her cheeks had filled out, the pale translucence of her skin replaced by a sun-weathered flush. She was no longer the fragile porcelain doll standing on an auction crate. She was becoming a creature of the mountain. Elias taught her to ride the roan mare, whom she had named Bess. It was not the gentle trotting of a Sunday carriage ride. He taught her to ride astride, her skirts bunched up, her knees gripping the animal's flanks as they navigated the scree slopes and the swollen creek crossings. "Keep your center low," Elias called out one morning as Clara guided the mare up a steep ridge. "If you fight the horse, you will fall. You have to move like water." Clara gritted her teeth, leaning forward into the mare's neck, feeling the powerful muscles bunch and release beneath her. When they crested the ridge, the wind whipping her hair from its braid, she felt a surge of exhilaration that was foreign and intoxicating. She looked over at Elias, who sat atop his massive black gelding, watching her. He gave a sharp, singular nod of approval. It was worth more to her than any poem she had ever read in a parlor. With the ground softening, Clara claimed a patch of earth on the south side of the cabin for a garden. She found a rusted spade in the lean-to and turned the soil herself, her hands blistering and then callousing. She had ridden to town with Elias once to buy supplies, and she had used the last of the coins found in her father's coat to buy packets of seed, turnips, potatoes, and runner beans. Elias watched her planting one afternoon, leaning on his axe. The frost might still take them, he warned, though his voice lacked its usual edge. "Then I will plant them again," Clara said, patting the dark earth over a seed. "Things want to grow." "Elias, even here." He said nothing, but the next day, she found he had constructed a crude fence of willow branches around her plot to keep the deer out. As the days grew longer, the necessity of the frontier demanded expansion. The single room was too small for two lives that were slowly expanding to fill the space. Elias decided to build a smokehouse attached to the north wall, a place to cure the venison and store the winter furs. They worked together. Clara was no longer relegated to sweeping. She hauled the smaller logs, mixed the chinking mud, and held the timbers in place while Elias drove the iron spikes. It was late afternoon when the sky bruised purple and opened up. It was not a snowstorm this time, but a torrential spring deluge. Cold and heavy, they were wrestling a heavy ridgepole into place. "Heave!" Elias grunted, his boots slipping in the mud. Clara shoved upward with all her strength, her muscles trembling, water streaming into her eyes. The wood groaned and slotted into the notch. They stepped back, panting. The rain was coming down in sheets, soaking them to the skin in seconds. Clara's hair was plastered to her skull. her dress clinging to her body, outlining the curves she usually kept hidden beneath layers of wool. Elias stood with his chest heaving, his wet shirt translucent against his skin. They looked at one another. The adrenaline of the exertion was still coursing through them, mixed with the wild energy of the storm. Elias wiped the water from his eyes, and his gaze stopped on her face. For months, he had looked at her with a carefully constructed indifference, or at most, a guarded protectiveness. But now, with the rain washing away the barriers, Clara saw something else. She saw a raw, starving hunger. It was in the way his eyes tracked a droplet of water running down her neck. It was in the tension of his hands, half raised as if to reach for her. Clara did not think. The instinct was sudden and overwhelming. She stepped forward, closing the distance between them. "Elias," she whispered, though the wind tore the name away. She reached up and placed her hand on his wet cheek. His beard was rough, waterlogged. He froze, his eyes widening, his pupils blown wide. Clara rose on her tiptoes and pressed her mouth to his. His lips were cold from the rain, but beneath the surface, there was a searing heat. For a second, he stood rigid as a statue. Then, a low sound broke from his throat, something between a groan and a sob. His arms came around her, crushing her against him. He kissed her back with a desperate, clumsy intensity, his mouth devouring hers, his hands tangling in her wet hair. It was a kiss of 3 months of silence, of winter nights spent listening to each other breathe, of fear and survival and proximity. Clara felt her knees weaken, her body molding against the hard planes of his chest. Then, just as suddenly, he tore himself away. He stumbled back, nearly slipping in the mud. He looked at her with an expression of horror, his chest heaving. "No," he rasped. He backed away, holding his hands up as if she were the one holding a weapon. "No, I cannot, Elias." Clara reached for him, confused, her blood singing. "I am not good for you." "Clara!" he shouted over the rain. His face was twisted in agony. "You do not know. You do not know what I am. You do not know what I have done." He turned and walked rapidly away, not toward the cabin, but into the darkening woods, disappearing into the downpour. Clara stood alone in the mud, the rain mingling with the hot tears on her face, the taste of him still on her lips. The distance returned, but it was brittle now, sharp as broken glass. Elias slept in the lean-to for 3 nights, claiming he needed to watch for wolves. But Clara knew he was watching for his own weakness. At night, the silence of the cabin was no longer peaceful. It was filled with the echoes of Clara's past. Perhaps the kiss had unlocked something, some gate she had kept barred. Her dreams, which had been mercifully blank during the struggle of winter, became vivid and terrifying. She dreamt of the church in Helena, the smell of old hymnals and beeswax. She saw the man who had taken over her father's pulpit after the debts were revealed, a man of God who spoke of sin while his hands lingered too long on her shoulders. She felt his hot breath in her ear, whispering scriptures twisted into threats. "Obey, Clara, submit, and the debt will be forgiven." She woke up gasping, her sheets tangled around her legs, sweat cooling on her skin. In the darkness, she heard Elias shift in the lean-to, the creak of wood through the thin wall. He was awake. He heard her whimpering. He heard her cry out, "No," in the dark. But he did not come to her. He stayed on his side of the wall, a sentinel who believed himself too tainted to offer comfort. A week after the storm, the supply of flour ran low. Elias was mending a harness and refused to look her in the eye. "I'm going to town," Clara announced, tying her bonnet strings with forceful tugs. Elias looked up, his brow furrowing. "I will saddle the black—" "No," Clara said firmly. "I will take Bess, and I will go alone." Elias stood slowly. "It is not safe." "Clara, I know how to shoot," she said, tapping the rifle scabbard she had already slung over her shoulder. "I know the trail, and I need to breathe." "Elias." He looked at her, seeing the steel in her spine that he had helped forge. He did not argue. He simply nodded and went back to his harness. Though his knuckles were white, the ride to Bitter Creek was lonely, the mud sucking at Bess's hooves. When Clara rode into town, the atmosphere was different than the day of the auction. She was no longer a shivering girl on a block. She sat tall in the saddle, wearing a coat made of cured deer hide that Elias had stitched for her. But the town had not changed. The eyes that followed her were still hard. Women in bonnets, standing on the boardwalks, whispered behind their hands as she passed. "That is her," she heard a washerwoman hiss. "The one Boone bought, living up there in sin." "Whore," another voice muttered, though Clara kept her eyes forward. She tied Bess to the rail of the general store and went inside. The shopkeeper, a balding man named Henderson, served her with a stiff, judgmental silence. She bought the flour, a bag of dried apples, and a tin of coffee. As she was packing her saddlebags, a burst of laughter erupted from the saloon next door. Two men stumbled out, leaning on each other. One was an older man with a gray beard, clearly deep in his cups. He spotted Clara and stopped, swaying. "Well, look at that," he slurred. "It is the mountain man's concubine." Clara ignored him, tightening the strap on the saddlebag. "Tell me, girl," the drunk shouted, stumbling closer. "Does he sleep with one eye open? Or does he think the ghosts cannot find him up there?" Clara froze. She turned slowly to face him. "What did you say?" The man laughed, a wet, ugly sound. "Boone. Everyone knows what he is. Acts like a saint now, living in the clouds. But I was in distinctive territory in '69. I know what he did. Come on, Jeb," his friend urged, pulling at his arm. "Leave it be. No." The drunk shook him off. "She ought to know. She ought to know she is sleeping with a butcher. He killed a man in cold blood, a girl, walked right into his house, put a bullet in his brain, and then burned the homestead to the ground, burned it to ash." Clara felt the blood drain from her face. "It is a lie," she said, though her voice trembled. "Is it?" The drunk leaned in, his breath reeking of whiskey. "Ask him about the fire. Ask him why he never comes down from that mountain. He has got blood on his hands that snow won't wash off." Clara mounted Bess and kicked the mare into a gallop, fleeing the town and the laughter that followed her. The ride back was a blur. The landscape passed unnoticed. All she could hear was the drunk's voice. "Butcher, cold blood, burned it to ash." She remembered the rage in Elias's eyes when he held the knife to Calloway's throat. She remembered the darkness in him that he constantly held back. When she reached the cabin, the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the valley. Elias was chopping wood, the rhythmic thwack of the axe echoing off the cliffs. Clara slid from the saddle. She did not take the groceries inside. She walked straight to him. Elias stopped mid-swing. He saw her face, pale, shaken, but fierce. He lowered the axe. "What happened?" he asked, his voice tight. "Did someone touch you?" Clara shook her head. "No one touched me, but they spoke to me." Elias went still. "They told me what you did," Clara said, her voice rising. "A man in town. He said you killed a man 10 years ago. He said you burned his house down." Elias looked away, toward the tree line where the shadows were deepest. He did not speak. "Tell me it is not true," Clara pleaded. "Tell me it was a lie." Elias turned back to her. His face was a mask of exhaustion. He looked old, infinitely weary. "I cannot tell you that," he said softly. Clara took a step back, her hand going to her mouth. "Why, Elias, why? You are not a murderer. I know you. You saved me. I'm exactly what they say I am," Elias said. His voice was flat, dead. It was 1869, Wyoming territory. He drove the axe into the chopping block and left it there, the handle quivering. He walked to the water barrel and splashed his face, as if trying to wash away the memory. His name was Miller, Elias said, his back to her. He was a sprawling man, mean when he drank. My sister, Sarah, she married him. She thought she could change him. Clara went silent. The name hung in the air. "Sarah, she wrote me letters," Elias continued. "Said everything was fine, but the letters stopped. I rode out to check on her. It took me 3 weeks to get there." He turned around. His eyes were swimming, not with tears, but with a terrifying clarity. "I found her in the kitchen. She had been dead for 2 days. He had beaten her. Elias's voice cracked, fracturing under the weight of the memory. He had beaten her until there was nothing left of her face, and he was sitting there at the table, drinking whiskey, crying about how she had provoked him. Clara let out a soft gasp, tears springing to her eyes. "Oh, God, I did not say a word. Elias said, I walked in, I put my coat on his forehead, and I pulled the trigger." He looked at his hands, large, capable hands that had built her home, fed her, protected her. "I wrapped Sarah in a sheet and buried her under the cottonwood tree. And then I set the house on fire. I wanted it gone. I wanted every trace of him, every trace of that room to be erased from the earth. I watched it burn until the chimney fell." He looked at Clara. The silence was absolute. "I have been running ever since," he whispered. "I thought if I went high enough, if I went deep enough into the wild, God might not find me. But you cannot run from what you are. I am a killer. Clara, that is why I cannot be with you. You deserve life. I am dead." Clara looked at him. She saw the monster he believed he was, but she also saw the brother who had ridden 3 weeks to save his sister. She saw the man who had avenged the defenseless. She saw the man who had bought her freedom and asked for nothing. She walked toward him. "Clara, do not," he warned, backing up until he hit the cabin wall. Clara did not stop. She walked until she was standing toe-to-toe with him. She reached out and took his rough, calloused hands in hers. "You are not dead," she said fiercely. "You are justice." She released his hands and reached for the buttons of her coat. She undid them, one by one. Her eyes locked on his. She shrugged the coat off, letting it fall to the dirt. Then she reached for the buttons of her dress. "Clara," Elias breathed, his voice trembling. "I am not Sarah," she said, "and you are not Miller." She pushed the dress from her shoulders. It pooled at her feet. She stood before him in her white chemise, the evening air cool on her skin, but her blood hot. "I do not want to be bought." "Elias," she said, her voice steady and clear. "I do not want to be saved. I want to be taken. I want you to know that you are not just a killer. You are a man, and you are my man." Elias made a sound like a man breaking. He reached out, his hands shaking violently, and touched her waist. "Are you sure?" he whispered, his forehead resting against hers. "If we do this, I will not be able to let you go. I never asked you to," she answered. He swept her up into his arms. He carried her into the cabin, kicking the door shut behind them. He carried her to the narrow cot and laid her down as if she were made of glass. But when he came over her, there was no fragility in him. He kissed her, and this time, he did not pull away. The kiss was desperation. It was 10 years of loneliness meeting a lifetime of suppression. He undressed, revealing a body mapped with scars, bullet wounds, knife slashes, the marks of a life lived at the edge of the world. Clara ran her hands over them, claiming every jagged line. Their lovemaking was not the gentle, romantic union of storybooks. It was frantic, heated, and raw. It was a collision. Elias moved with a hunger that terrified and thrilled her, burying his face in her neck, his hands gripping her hips as if he were drowning and she was the only solid ground. Clara met him, arching into him, demanding more. For the first time in her life, her body was her own, to give and to share. She was not a victim. She was a participant. In the heat of the dark cabin, with the fire dying in the stove, they burned out the ghosts. When it was over, the silence that settled was heavy, but it was no longer empty. They lay tangled in the furs, limbs heavy, skin slick with sweat. Elias lay with his head on her chest, his breathing slowing. Then, Clara felt the dampness on her skin. She shifted and realized he was crying, great, silent, racking sobs that shook his massive frame. The mountain man, the killer, the survivor, was weeping like a child in her arms. Clara did not hush him. She did not tell him to stop. She wrapped her arms around his head, stroking his hair, her fingers tracing the scar on his temple. "I am sorry," he choked out, his voice muffled against her skin. "I am so sorry." "Shh," Clara whispered. She kissed the top of his head. "You gave me this land, Elias," she said softly into the dark. You gave me a life. Now, let me give you peace." He tightened his hold on her, burying his face deeper. And as the night deepened over the Montana mountains, Elias Boone finally stopped running. The sun that summer did not just warm the valley, it seemed to consecrate it. The snow that had once felt like a prison wall melted into 1,000 silver tributaries, feeding the river until it ran clear and cold over the stones. The wildflowers, Indian paintbrush, lupine, and wild rose exploded across the meadow in a riot of color that made the grim gray of the winter feel like a distant nightmare. For Clara Leving and Elias Boone, the season brought a peace that was as terrifying as it was beautiful. They had survived the cold, but now they were surviving the quiet. And in that quiet, a profound intimacy began to take root. The days were long and filled with the rhythmic labor of homesteading. They finished the smokehouse, the smell of curing hickory replacing the damp scent of rot. They expanded the garden, where Clara's potatoes and snap peas grew with a vigor that surprised them both. But the work was no longer a desperate race against death. It was a partnership. They moved around one another with a fluid, unconscious grace. When Elias chopped wood, Clara was there to stack it before he could bend down. When Clara kneaded dough, Elias would wordlessly add wood to the stove to bring it to the perfect baking heat. They spoke less, but said more. A touch on the shoulder meant, "I am here." A look across the table meant, "I am content." One sweltering afternoon in July, when the air was thick with the drone of cicadas and the heat radiated in shimmering waves off the granite cliffs, Elias dropped his hammer. "It is too hot to work," he announced, wiping sweat from his brow with his forearm. Clara looked up from the tub where she was scrubbing shirts, her hair plastered to her neck. "And what do you propose, Mr. Boone?" "We cannot command the sun to lower itself." Elias offered a rare, boyish grin that took 10 years off his face. "The river," he said. They walked down to the water's edge, the grass brushing against their knees. The river was deep here, pooling in a slow eddy beneath the shade of a massive cottonwood tree. Elias did not hesitate. He stripped off his shirt and boots and waded in, fully clothed in his trousers. He ducked his head under the water and came up shaking his hair like a great bear, sending spray flying. Clara stood on the bank, hesitant. The propriety instilled in her by her father's church screamed that a woman did not swim in the open, certainly not with a man. "Are you going to stand there and bake?" Elias called out. "Treading water, or are you coming in?" Clara looked at the cool, dark water. She looked at Elias, his wet skin gleaming like copper in the dappled sunlight. She unbuttoned her heavy boots. She unpinned her hair, letting it fall in a heavy curtain down her back. And then, defying every sermon she had ever heard, she waded in her chemise and petticoats. The cold was shocking, stealing the breath from her lungs, but the relief was instant. She gasped, splashing water onto her face. Elias watched her, his eyes dark and tender. He swam toward her, moving effortlessly against the current. He reached out and pulled her deeper, until her feet lost the bottom and she had to hold on to his shoulders to stay afloat. "You are heavy with all that cloth," he teased, his voice low and rough near her ear. "And you are heavy with all that muscle," she retorted, splashing water into his face. He laughed, a full, deep sound that rumbled against her chest. He caught her waist, pulling her flush against him. The playfulness vanished, replaced by the sudden, intense gravity that always simmered between them. The water was cold, but where their bodies touched, there was fire. He kissed her, tasting river water and sunlight. They floated there, suspended in the current. The world narrowed down to the sensation of wet cotton and warm skin. That night, they did not sleep apart. They had not slept apart since the night of the confession. They lay tangled together on the narrow cot, the furs kicked off in the heat. Elias slept with his arm thrown over her waist, his face buried in the crook of her neck. Clara lay awake for a long time, listening to the owls hunting in the timber, feeling the steady beat of his heart against her back. She realized, with a jolt of wonder, that she was happy. Elias, too, was changing. The haunted look that had defined him, the look of a man expecting judgment, was fading. He began to plan for a future that extended beyond the next snowfall. He spent his evenings on the porch, whittling. He told Clara he was making new latches for the shutters, but he would hide the wood whenever she came near. In truth, he was working on a piece of shed elk antler. It was hard material, unforgiving, but durable as stone. He was carving a ring. He worked with the tip of his smallest knife, scraping away the bone dust with infinite patience, smoothing the inner curve until it was as soft as silk. He was not a man of words. He could not write her a poem, but he could make her something that would never break, never rust, and never fade. One evening, as the twilight turned the sky a bruised purple, they sat on the porch steps. Elias was smoking a pipe, the smoke curling lazily into the still air. Clara leaned her head on his shoulder. "Elias, do you ever wonder if he is still out there?" Elias did not need to ask who he was. The shadow of the preacher. The man who had taken over her father's pulpit and turned her life into a cage had never fully left them. "He is out there," Elias said quietly. "Men like that do not just vanish. They move like locusts, consuming one field and moving to the next." Clara shivered. Despite the warmth of the evening, "He used to make me kneel on dried corn for hours," she whispered. "He said it was to mortify the flesh. He said my spirit was too proud, that I had a rebellious heart because I wanted to read novels instead of Leviticus. He told the town I was loose, so that no one would believe me if I spoke." She felt Elias's muscles coil beneath her cheek, turning to iron. He twisted scripture. Clara continued, her voice trembling slightly. "He made God sound like a jailer. He made me believe that my desire to be free was the devil's work. When my father died, he was the one who sold the debt. He told the creditors I was of no use to the church." Elias took the pipe from his mouth and set it on the step. He turned to her, taking her face in his large, rough hands. He forced her to look at him. "Listen to me," he said. His voice was low, but it carried the lethal weight of a rock slide. "I cannot change what he did. I cannot unspeak the lies he told. But I can promise you this." He leaned in, his gray eyes burning with a terrifying protectiveness. "If he ever comes near you again, if I ever see his shadow cross your path, he will not leave breathing. I will not give him the mercy of a quick death." Clara looked into his eyes and saw the killer he had admitted to being. But for the first time, the violence in him did not frighten her. It felt like a wall, high and thick, built solely to keep the wolves at bay. "I know," she whispered, and she believed him. But the world outside the valley was not content to let them be. August brought the dry winds, and with them, the return of trouble. It started with a rider coming up the trail, not a threat this time, but a warning. It was young Toby, the son of the livery stable owner in Bitter Creek. He rode a sweating pony and looked terrified as he pulled up to the cabin. "Mr. Boone," Toby shouted. "Mr. Boone, you best come down." Elias stepped off the porch, his rifle in hand. "What is it, boy?" "It is Jeb Calloway," Toby stammered. "He is back, and he has brought a judge with him, a circuit judge from Helena. They are at the saloon, and Calloway is telling everyone that you hold no claim to this land." Elias's face hardened. "I have the deed. Calloway says it is a fake," Toby cried. "He says you forged it. He says you cannot even read. So how could you sign a contract? The judge has summoned you. If you do not come down by sundown tomorrow to prove your claim, the sheriff says he has to evict you." Clara stepped out onto the porch, wiping flour from her hands. She saw the color drain from Elias's face. It was not fear of violence. Elias Boone would fight an army. It was the deep, burning shame of a man whose weakness was being paraded before the world. "We will be there," Clara said, her voice cutting through the air. Elias stood silent as Toby turned his pony and rode back down the mountain. When he turned to Clara, his eyes were full of panic. "I cannot go down there." "Clara, you must," she said. "They will laugh at me. The judge, he will ask me to read the papers. You know I cannot. I can track a deer over granite. I can build a house from trees, but I cannot make sense of their scratchings. Calloway knows it. He is using the law to steal what he could not take with a knife. Clara walked down the steps and took his hand. He is not using the law. Elias, he is using your pride against you. But he forgot one thing. What? Elias asked miserably. He forgot that you are not alone. They rode out at dawn. Elias wore his best shirt, though it was tight across the shoulders, and he had oiled his boots. Clara wore her blue dress, the one she had mended and pressed until it looked respectable. She carried a leather satchel containing the deed and a small, bound ledger she had kept since her father's death. Bitter Creek was crowded. News of the hearing had spread, and the prospect of a land dispute involving the recluse mountain man was better entertainment than a dogfight. The saloon had been converted into a makeshift courtroom. A heavy oak table sat at the front, behind which sat Judge Thaddeus Black. Judge Black was a man who looked as if he had been carved from suet, pale, sweaty, and smelling of gin even at this hour. Jeb Calloway sat on a bench to the right, grinning like a skull, his arm still in a sling from where Elias had broken it. When Elias and Clara walked in, the room went silent. Elias walked with his head high, but Clara could feel the tension vibrating through his arm where it brushed hers. "Elias Boone!" The judge boomed. "You are accused of squatting on territory land and forging a deed of ownership. How do you plead?" "I bought this land," Elias said, his voice filling the room. "I paid 50 ounces of gold." "Hearsay!" Calloway shouted, jumping up. "Show us the receipt. Show us where you signed." The judge banged a gavel that looked suspiciously like a meat tenderizer. "Sit down. Calloway, Mr. Boone, approach the bench." Elias stepped forward. He placed the folded deed on the table. The judge picked it up, squinting at it. He looked at Elias with a sneer. "This document is signed with an X, Mr. Boone, and the witness signature is illegible. Mr. Calloway claims the original owner, a Mr. Henderson, died 2 years before this date. He claims you just moved into an empty cabin and scratched some ink on paper." "It is not true," Elias ground out. "Then read the fine print for me," the judge challenged. Leaning back, "Read the survey coordinates listed in the second paragraph. Prove to me you understand the contract you claim to have made." The room tittered. Elias stood frozen. He looked at the paper. The black mark swam before his eyes, mocking him. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. His hands curled into fists at his sides. He looked ready to tear the room apart or to vanish into the floor. "May I speak, Your Honor?" Clara's voice rang out, clear and bell-like. She stepped forward from behind Elias. "And who are you?" the judge asked, eyeing her. "I am Clara Leving. I am Mr. Boone's partner in this holding, and I was present when the deed was transferred." She opened her satchel. She did not look at Calloway. She looked straight at the judge. "Mr. Boone's literacy is irrelevant to the exchange of gold, Your Honor, but if you require proof of the transaction's validity, I have it here." She pulled out the ledger. "This is a record of the auction house of Silas Vane, dated November 1878. If you look at the entry for the 18th, you will see a notation for the sale of one bondswoman and the transfer of the deed to the property at Bitter Creek Ridge to Elias Boone, in exchange for 50 ounces. She slammed the book onto the table. "Furthermore," she continued, her voice gaining strength, "Mr. Calloway claims the previous owner died 2 years ago. However, here is a tax receipt from the Territory Office, signed by the clerk in Helena just 6 months ago, acknowledging payment on the parcel by the previous owner. I found it in the cabin when we arrived." She pulled a crumpled yellow paper from the bag and smoothed it out. "Unless ghosts pay taxes. Your Honor, Mr. Calloway is lying." The room erupted in murmurs. The judge snatched the papers. He compared the dates. He looked at Calloway, whose grin had vanished. He looked at Clara, who stood with the regal bearing of a queen in a muddy mining town. "The documentation seems in order," the judge grumbled. He banged the gavel. "Case dismissed. The land belongs to Boone. Calloway, if you waste my time again, I will hold you in contempt." Elias let out a breath that seemed to empty his lungs. He looked at Clara with a mixture of awe and adoration so profound it made her knees weak. He took her hand, ignoring the crowd, and kissed the knuckles. "Let us go home," he whispered. They turned to leave. The crowd parted, some men tipping their hats to Clara now, respecting the way she had flayed Calloway with nothing but paper and words. They stepped out onto the boardwalk into the blinding afternoon sun. The adrenaline was fading, replaced by a giddy sense of victory. "I will go get the horses," Elias said, squeezing her hand. "Wait here." He stepped off the boardwalk toward the livery. Clara stood there, closing her eyes, turning her face to the sun. They had won. The land was theirs. No one could touch them. A stagecoach had just pulled in down the street, kicking up a cloud of dust. The door opened, and passengers began to step out. A businessman in a plaid suit, a woman with a crying baby, and then a tall, thin figure in a long black coat. Clara's eyes snapped open. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. The sounds of the street, the blacksmith's hammer, the shouting of children, the rattle of wagons, faded into a buzzing silence. He stepped down onto the dirt. He wore a flat-brimmed hat and carried a heavy, leather-bound Bible under his arm. His face was gaunt, pale as parchment, with eyes that burned with a cold, fanatical light. It was him, Reverend Malachi Ford. He stood there, brushing dust from his coat. He looked around the town with a sneer of distaste, judging the sinfulness of the place with a single glance. Clara felt a physical blow to her chest. Her heart stopped, then hammered a frantic, bird-like rhythm against her ribs. He had found her. Or perhaps it was a chance. It didn't matter. He was here. Panic, cold and sharp, clawed at her throat. She took a step back into the shadows of the store awning. Her first thought was to run to Elias. "Elias, he is here." But then she remembered the promise on the porch. "If he ever comes near you again, he will not leave breathing." She looked toward the livery. Elias was leading the horses out, a smile on his face, a smile she had put there. If she told him, the smile would vanish. He would hand her the reins, walk down the street, and put a bullet in the preacher's head. And then the sheriff would arrest him. The judge was still in the saloon. There would be a trial. Elias would be hanged for murder. She saw the noose as clearly as she saw the mountains. She could not let that happen. She could not let her past destroy his future. Clara turned her back to the street, trembling violently. She pulled her bonnet low, hiding her face. "Clara?" Elias was there, holding Bess's reins. He looked at her, his smile fading instantly as he saw her posture. "What is it?" he asked, stepping closer. "Did Calloway say something?" Clara kept her head down. "No," she whispered. Her voice sounded brittle, strange to her own ears. "Then what is wrong? You are shaking. I just want to leave. Elias, please, take me home, now." She scrambled onto the horse without waiting for his help. She kept her face turned away from the stagecoach, away from the black figure who was now walking toward the hotel. Elias watched her, confused and concerned. He looked down the street, scanning for a threat, but saw only strangers. He mounted the black gelding. They rode out of town. The victory that had tasted so sweet moments ago had turned to ash in Clara's mouth. The ride back up the mountain was agonizing. Elias tried to speak to her twice. "Clara, you were magnificent in there," he said, riding beside her. She did not answer. She stared straight ahead, her eyes fixed on the trail, her mind racing with terror. "Does he know I am here? Did he see me? How long will he stay?" "Clara," Elias pressed. "I am tired. Elias," she snapped. "Please, I just need quiet." Elias recoiled as if she had slapped him. He pulled his horse back slightly, giving her space. The silence that fell between them was not the companionable silence of the summer. It was a wall. It was the old silence of the winter, thick with secrets and fear. When they reached the cabin, Clara practically fell off her horse and rushed inside. She went straight to the window, peering out through the crack in the shutter, checking the tree line. Elias entered behind her. He stood in the center of the room, watching her frantic movements. "Tell me what is wrong," he demanded softly. "You have gone cold on me. Clara." Nothing is wrong, she lied, turning to face him. Her face was pale, her eyes guarded. It was just the stress of the trial. The judge. He reminded me of my father. That is all. Elias looked at her. He knew her. He knew the rhythm of her breathing, the way she held her hands. He knew she was lying, and the hurt that crossed his face was devastating. He had opened himself to her completely. He had let her fight his battle. He had let her see his shame, and now she was shutting him out. He nodded slowly, his expression closing off. "If you say so," he said. He took his hat off and hung it on the peg. He did not go to her. He did not touch her. He walked to the stove and began to build a fire, his back stiff and unyielding. Clara stood by the window, watching the sun go down, casting long, blood-red shadows across the floor. She wanted to run to him, to bury her face in his chest and tell him everything, but she loved him too much to let him become a murderer for her. So she stayed where she was, clutching her arms to her chest, while the distance between them grew with every crackle of the fire. The preacher was in the valley, and the winter had returned to her heart. The poison did not spread through the water or the air. It spread through the word of God, twisted and blackened by the tongue of Reverend Malachi Ford. He did not immediately march up the mountain. He was a creature of patience, a spider who understood that the web must be spun tight before the fly is struck. He set up a makeshift pulpit in the town square, beneath the shade of the livery overhang, and he began to preach. His voice was a beautiful instrument, deep and resonant, carrying the weight of absolute conviction. He spoke of purity. He spoke of the corruption that festered in the high places. He spoke of a woman led astray by a beast, a Jezebel living in sin with a murderer, staining the very soul of the valley. The town of Bitter Creek, which had begun to begrudgingly respect Clara Leving for her defiance of the judge, found itself wavering. The woman, who had once whispered in admiration of her strength, now crossed the street to avoid looking up at the ridge. The men, emboldened by Ford's rhetoric of righteous anger, began to mutter again about the mountain man who had bought a wife and likely forced her into depravity. Clara felt the change in the air like a drop in barometric pressure before a storm. When she went to the creek to wash clothes, she felt eyes on her from the tree line. When the wind blew from the town, it seemed to carry the faint, chanting rhythm of Ford's sermons. She stopped going to town. She stayed close to the cabin, her rifle always within reach. She did not tell Elias about the man she had seen. She told herself she was protecting him, but deep down, she knew she was paralyzed by the childish, primal fear that Malachi Ford had instilled in her years ago. It was a Tuesday, mid-morning. Elias had ridden to the high pasture to check on the horses. Clara was in the garden, kneeling in the dirt, pulling weeds from around the squash plants. The sun was hot on her neck. "Hello, Sister Clara." The voice was soft, oily, and terrifyingly familiar. Clara froze. The trowel slipped from her hand. She did not turn around immediately. She squeezed her eyes shut, praying it was a nightmare, a hallucination brought on by the heat. You cannot hide from the shepherd. Clara, even in the wilderness. She turned slowly. Malachi Ford stood on the other side of the willow fence. He was dressed in his severe black coat. Despite the heat, not a bead of sweat on his pale, gaunt face. He held his Bible against his chest like a shield. He looked exactly as he had in the church vestry when she was 16, pious, calm, and radiating a predatory hunger. "Get off this land," Clara whispered, rising to her feet. Her legs felt like water. "Is this your land?" Ford asked, stepping over the low fence as if it were nothing. "Or does it belong to the animal who bought you? I heard the price was 50 ounces. A high price for damaged goods." Clara took a step back, her hand fumbling at her waist for the knife she usually carried. But she had left it on the porch. "Elias will kill you," she said, her voice shaking. "Elias," Ford mused, tasting the name. "Yes, the man who burned a homestead in Wyoming. The man who put a bullet in his own brother-in-law's skull?" Clara's breath hitched. "You think I came here blindly?" Ford smiled, a thin stretching of lips that did not reach his dead eyes. I have a memory for sinners. Clara, and I have ears. The drunkards in this town are very talkative. They tell me your protector is a cold-blooded killer." He took another step. Clara backed up until her heels hit the log wall of the cabin. "He is a good man," Clara spat, tears of rage and terror stinging her eyes. "He is 10 times the man you are." "He is a murderer," Ford corrected gently. "And you are his harlot. You lay with him. You let him touch you with hands that have taken life. That makes you unclean. Clara, just as you were unclean when you looked at the boys in the choir. Just as you were unclean when you refused to humble yourself before me." He was close now, close enough that she could smell the stale tobacco and peppermint on his breath. He reached out and touched a lock of hair that had escaped her bonnet. Clara flinched violently, slapping his hand away. "Do not touch me!" Ford's face hardened. He grabbed her wrist, his fingers digging into her skin like iron bands. "You need to be saved. Clara, you need to be cleansed. I have come to offer you a choice. You will leave this place. You will come back to town with me, publicly confess your sins, and enter the service of the Lord as a penitent. You will wash the floors of the church and beg forgiveness until your knees bleed. I would rather die," Clara hissed. "Then you will be responsible for his death," Ford whispered, leaning in. "If you stay, I will bring the law down on him. I will write to the marshal in Wyoming. I will have him hanged. Clara, I will watch him kick and choke at the end of a rope. And I will tell him, as the light leaves his eyes, that it was your sin that killed him." He released her wrist with a shove. Clara stumbled against the logs. "Think about it, sister. I will give you one day. If you are not at the hotel by sundown tomorrow, I will send the telegram." He turned and walked away, vanishing into the trees as silently as a snake sliding through grass. Clara slid down the wall of the cabin until she hit the dirt. She pulled her knees to her chest and buried her face in her apron, trying to muffle the sobs that tore through her. He had found the one thing that could break her. He had found the leverage. She could endure his abuse. She could endure the town's scorn. But she could not endure the image of Elias swinging from the gallows because of her. She sat there for an hour, the sun beating down on her, until her tears dried into a hard, brittle resolve. She stood up. She dusted off her apron. She went inside the cabin. She pulled her old canvas valise from under the bed. She began to pack. She took only what she had come with: her spare dress, her mother's Bible, a comb. She left the coat Elias had made her. She left the rifle he had taught her to use. She left the ring he was carving, which sat unfinished on the mantelpiece. She could not say goodbye. If she looked at him, if he touched her, she would crumble. She had to be gone before he returned from the pasture. She would ride to the next town, take a stagecoach west, disappear into the anonymity of the coast. If she was gone, Ford would have no reason to hunt Elias. The leverage would be gone. She was buckling the strap of the valise when the door opened. She jumped, spinning around. Elias stood in the doorway. He was covered in dust, his shirt damp with sweat, holding a bridle in his hand. He looked at the valise on the table. He looked at Clara's tear-streaked face. He dropped the bridle. It hit the floor with a heavy clatter. "What are you doing?" he asked. His voice was very quiet. Clara's hands trembled as she gripped the back of a chair. I have to go. Elias, go! Where? Just away. I cannot stay here." He walked into the room, closing the door behind him. The air suddenly felt too small for the two of them. "Is it the winter?" he asked, searching her face. "Is it the work? Did I do something?" "No!" Clara cried out. "No, Elias, you have been perfect. You are." "Then why are you packing a bag?" he demanded, his voice rising. "Why are you running? We just fought for this land. We won. We did not win," Clara shouted back, the hysteria bubbling up. "We can never win, not against him." Elias went still. The confusion vanished from his face, replaced by a dangerous focus. "Him? Who is he?" Clara clamped her hand over her mouth, but it was too late. The dam had broken. "Tell me, Clara, he is here," she sobbed, collapsing into the chair. Malachi Ford. He is here in town. Elias stared at her. The preacher, the one who hurt you, he came here. Clara wept. He was in the garden. He knows about Wyoming. Elias, he knows about Miller. He said if I do not leave with him, if I do not submit, he will send for the marshal. He will have you hanged. She looked up at him, her eyes pleading. Do you not see? I have to go. If I stay, you die. I cannot let him kill you. Elias stood there for a long moment. His face was unreadable, carved from granite. He looked at the valise. He looked at the fear in her eyes. Fear not for herself, but for him. He walked over to the table. He picked up the valise. Elias, please. He opened the stove door and threw the bag inside. Clara screamed, lunging for it, but he caught her by the waist and pulled her back against his chest. He held her there, an iron band of restraint, while the canvas caught fire and curled into ash. You are not going anywhere, he growled into her hair. He will hang you, Clara sobbed, beating her fists against his arms. Let me go, no! He spun her around and gripped her shoulders. I have spent 10 years running from what I did, he said, his voice shaking with a suppressed fury that terrified her more than the fire. I let fear dictate my life. I lived in a hole because I thought I deserved the dark. But you pulled me out. Clara, you. He leaned down, his forehead pressing against hers. Let him send the marshal. Let him bring the whole United States Army. I will not let you walk away from this mountain to save my skin. Do you understand? I would rather hang 1,000 times than let that man possess you again. But what can we do? Clara whispered, her fight draining away. He has the town. He has the law. Elias released her. He walked to the wall and took down his gun belt. He buckled it on. He has a big mouth, Elias said coldly. And he thinks he is untouchable because he hides behind a Bible. He checked the load in his revolver. Where are you going? Clara asked, fear spiking again. You promised. You said you wouldn't kill him. I am not going to kill him, Elias said. Killing him is too easy, and it would make his lies true. He grabbed his coat. Lock the door. Clara, load the rifle. Do not open it for anyone but me. I am coming with you. No, you stay here. I have to ride. Ride where? To get the truth, Elias said. He walked out the door. A moment later, she heard the thunder of the black gelding's hooves tearing down the trail, heading not toward town, but east, toward the mining camps and the rail line. 2 days passed, 2 days of agonizing silence. Clara did not sleep. She sat by the window with the Henry rifle across her lap, watching the trail. She imagined Ford returning. She imagined the sheriff riding up. She imagined Elias lying dead in a ditch. On the morning of the 3rd day, Sunday, the church bell in Bitter Creek began to ring. It was a slow, mournful tolling that echoed up the canyon walls. Clara could stand it no longer. If Elias was dead, she needed to know. If he was in jail, she needed to be there. She saddled Bess. She dressed not in her work clothes, but in her blue dress, the same one she had worn to the hearing. She pinned her hair up severely and tight. She rode down the mountain with her head high. The town was deserted. The saloon was empty. The general store was closed. Everyone was at the church, a white clapboard building at the end of the street that Malachi Ford had commandeered. Clara dismounted and tied Bess to the rail. She could hear Ford's voice booming from inside, the windows vibrating with his fervor. She walked up the steps. She pushed open the double doors. The church was packed. Every soul in Bitter Creek seemed to be there. Ford stood at the pulpit, his arms raised, casting a long shadow over the congregation. And so we must purge the wickedness from our midst, he roared. We must cut out the rot before it consumes the whole body. The doors slammed shut behind Clara. The sound echoed like a gunshot. Every head turned. Malachi Ford stopped mid-sentence. He looked down the aisle and saw her. A slow, triumphant smile spread across his face. Ah, he said smoothly. The prodigal daughter returns. Have you come to repent, Sister Clara? Have you come to beg for salvation? Clara walked down the center aisle. Her boots clicked loudly on the floorboards. She did not look at the townsfolk. She looked only at Ford. I have come to tell you to leave, she said. Her voice was not loud, but it carried. Ford laughed. and the congregation tittered nervously. "Leave? This is God's house. Woman, you have no power here. You are a harlot living with a murderer." "He is not a murderer." The shout came from the back of the church. The crowd gasped and turned. Elias Boone stood in the open doorway. He looked exhausted. He was covered in road dust, his eyes rimmed with red. But he stood tall, and he was not alone. Beside him stood a woman. She was older, wearing a faded calico dress, her face lined with years of hardship, but her eyes were fierce, and behind her stood another woman, younger, holding a baby. The same woman from the stagecoach weeks ago. Elias walked down the aisle, guiding the women. The crowd parted for him, shrinking away from the size of him and the grim determination on his face. "Who are these people?" Ford demanded, his voice cracking slightly. "This is a sanctuary. You cannot bring your filth in here." Elias stopped at the front pew. He looked at Ford with a disgust so profound it silenced the room. "You like to talk about the past." "Ford," Elias said, "you like to talk about sins, so let us talk about yours." He turned to the older woman. "Mrs. Gable?" The woman stepped forward. She pointed a shaking finger at the pulpit. "That man is not a reverend," she announced, her voice ringing clear. "His name is Malachi Ford, but in Kansas, he called himself Reverend Black. He came to our town 5 years ago. He said he would save our souls. He took my husband's donation money for a new roof, and then he took my daughter into the cellar and..." She choked on a sob. Unable to finish, the room went deathly silent. "And you?" Elias said gently to the younger woman. The woman with the baby stepped up. "He was in Oak Haven last year," she whispered, looking at the floor. "He told me I had a demon in me. He said he had to drive it out. He forced me, and when I got with the child, he ran..." A murmur of shock rippled through the pews. Ford's face turned a sickly shade of gray. "Lies!" he screamed, slamming his hand on the pulpit. "These are whores paid by this killer to slander a man of God. Do not listen to them. They are agents of the devil." Elias looked at Clara. He nodded. Clara felt a surge of strength rise up from the soles of her feet. She looked at the man who had haunted her nightmares for years. He looked small now, desperate. "He is lying," Clara said, turning to face the town. She looked at the blacksmith. She looked at the shopkeeper. She looked at the women who had shunned her. "I was not a loose woman," she said steadily. "I was a girl who wanted to read books. I was a girl who asked questions, and for that, he punished me. He locked me in closets. He beat the soles of my feet so the marks wouldn't show. He told me I was worthless so that he could own me." She took a step toward the pulpit. "He does not serve God," she said. "He serves his own power. He feeds on fear, but I am not afraid anymore." She pointed at Elias. "That man purchased me to save me. He gave me a home without asking for anything. He has more honor in his little finger than you have in your entire body." Malachi Ford. The silence stretched, heavy and suffocating. Then, from the back, the blacksmith stood up. He was a big man, holding his hat. "I remember you, Mrs. Gable," he said slowly. "My brother wrote from Kansas about a preacher who stole roof money. Said he had a scar on his left hand." The blacksmith looked at Ford. "Show us your hand." "Reverend," Ford hid his left hand behind the Bible. "Get out," he shrieked. "All of you. This is blasphemy." But the spell was broken. The town saw him now, not as a prophet, but as a sweating, terrified con man caught in a web of his own making. Someone shouted, "Get him!" Ford's eyes darted around the room. He saw the anger rising in the faces of the men he had duped. He dropped the Bible and bolted for the side door near the choir loft. Elias moved. He vaulted over the communion rail with the grace of a mountain cat. He reached the door just as Ford threw it open. Ford ran straight into Elias's chest. "Going somewhere," Elias growled. Ford whimpered, reaching into his coat for a derringer. Elias caught his wrist. He didn't break it this time. He simply squeezed until Ford dropped the gun. Then, with a look of utter contempt, Elias shoved him backward. Ford stumbled and fell at the feet of Judge Black, who had been sitting in the front row, watching the proceedings with wide eyes. "Judge," Elias said, "I believe this man is wanted in Kansas for fraud and assault." The judge stood up, smoothing his vest. He looked at the trembling preacher, then at the angry town, and finally at Elias. "I believe you are right." "Mr. Boone," the judge said. "Sheriff! Shackles!" As the sheriff dragged a screaming Malachi Ford away, the crowd erupted into chaos. But Elias didn't watch. He turned to Clara. She was standing in the aisle, tears streaming down her face, not of fear, but of relief so profound it felt like being born again. Elias walked to her. He did not care about the crowd. He did not care about the gossip. He took her face in his hands and kissed her forehead, a benediction in front of God and everyone. "Let us go home," he said. That night, the cabin was quiet. The fire popped in the stove, casting a warm, golden glow over the room. The fear that had lived in the corners for so long was gone, banished by the truth. Clara sat on the edge of the bed, brushing her hair. Her hands were steady. Elias stood by the window, looking out at the moonlit valley. He turned and looked at her. "You could have killed him," Clara said softly. "When you caught him at the door, you could have snapped his neck." "I wanted to," Elias admitted, walking toward her. "For a moment, I wanted to tear him apart for what he did to you, but then I looked at you." He sat down beside her. "If I killed him, I would be the beast he said I was. And you would be the woman who loved a monster. I wanted you to be the woman who loved a man." Clara dropped the brush. She turned to him, seeing the vulnerability in his eyes, the fear that he was still unlovable, still damaged goods. She reached out and began to unbutton his shirt. "You are not a monster, Elias," she whispered. "You are the only good thing I have ever known." She pushed him back onto the pillows. This time, there was no frantic desperation, no need to prove anything. There was only a slow, aching tenderness. They made love with the windows open to the summer night. It was a worship of touch, a reclamation of skin and spirit. Elias moved over her with a reverence that made her weep. He kissed the scars on her soul, and she kissed the guilt from his. Afterward, they lay entwined, the sweat cooling on their bodies. Elias ran his hand down the curve of her spine. He rested his forehead against her shoulder. "You saved me today," he whispered. "I thought I was riding out to save you, but when you stood up in that church, when you spoke, I was terrified." Clara admitted, "I know." That is what made it brave. He pulled back to look at her. His thumb traced her lip. "I gave you this deed," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I told you that you own this land." Clara nodded, her eyes locked on his. "But you must know. Clara, you own me more. I am yours, every part of me. The good, the bad, the blood on my hands. It all belongs to you." Clara felt a sob rise in her throat, a release of the last lingering shame. She realized, with a clarity that shone like the stars outside, that she was no longer a victim. She was no longer a debtor. She was a woman who held the heart of a warrior in her hands. She pulled him down to her, wrapping her arms around his neck. "And I am yours, Elias," she whispered into the darkness. "Finally, I am yours." Outside, the wind whispered through the pines, no longer a threat, but a lullaby. The valley was theirs, the past was buried, and for the first time, the future stretched out before them, wide and wild and free. The autumn of 1879 arrived in the high country not with a whisper, but with a riot of gold. The aspen groves that lined the lower slopes turned a brilliant, trembling yellow, standing in sharp contrast to the deep, eternal green of the pines and the gray granite of the peaks. The air grew crisp, smelling of cured hay, wood smoke, and the metallic tang of coming frost. It was a season of preparation. In the years before, autumn had been a time of grim desperation for Elias Boone, a frantic race to stockpile enough meat and wood to survive the crushing solitude of the winter. But this year, the work was different. It was shared. It was joyful. It was built not just on survival, but on the promise of a future. They decided to expand the cabin. The single room that had once felt like a fortress now felt too small to contain the life they were building. They felled timber from the North Ridge, selecting straight, thick lodgepole pines. They worked side by side, stripping the bark, notching the ends, and hoisting the heavy logs into place to create a second room, a bedroom, separate from the main living area and the kitchen. Clara Leving, who had once struggled to lift a cast-iron skillet, now swung a mallet with practiced ease. She mixed the chinking mud, blending clay from the riverbank with straw and moss, and packed it tight between the logs to seal out the wind. Her hands were rough, her nails short, her skin browned by the mountain sun. She had never felt more beautiful. One afternoon, as they were shingling the new roof, the sound of horses echoed up the valley. Elias was on the roof, a nail between his teeth. He froze, his hand going instinctively to the hammer at his belt, but he did not reach for his rifle. That was the change. The reflex of violence was still there, but it was no longer the only language he spoke. Clara stood on the ground, shielding her eyes against the sun. 3 men were riding up the trail. They were not drifters or outlaws. They wore city suits, bowler hats, and carried leather satchels. One of them had a long brass instrument strapped to his saddle, a theodolite. Surveyors. Elias climbed down the ladder. He stood beside Clara, wiping his hands on a rag. He did not push her behind him. He stood with her, shoulder to shoulder. The lead rider pulled up his horse. He was a man with a waxed mustache and an air of officious importance. He looked at the cabin, then at the fresh construction, and finally at the rugged couple standing before him. "Good afternoon," the man said, though his tone suggested he found nothing good about being this far from civilization. "I am Mr. Horace Sterling, Chief Surveyor for the Northern Pacific Railroad." Clara stepped forward. "Good afternoon, Mr. Sterling. I am Clara Leving. This is Elias Boone. To what do we owe the pleasure?" Sterling blinked, surprised by her articulate speech. He pulled a map from his saddlebag and unrolled it against the pommel. "We are scouting a grade for a potential spur line through this pass," Sterling explained. "The company is assessing the viability of a route that would connect the mining camps to the main line. According to our preliminary charts, this section of the mountain is designated as open territory land." He looked at the cabin with a critical eye. "We will need to set markers through that meadow," Sterling continued, pointing to Clara's garden and the grazing pasture for the horses. "And likely, if the grade is approved, the track will run directly through where this structure stands. You squatters will need to vacate by spring." Elias stiffened, his jaw tightening. The old rage flared behind his eyes, the indignation of a man being told he has no place. But before he could speak, Clara laughed. It was a dry, sharp sound. "Squatters?" she repeated. "I'm afraid your charts are outdated, Mr. Sterling." She turned to Elias. "The deed, please." Elias went into the cabin. He returned a moment later with the heavy iron box. Clara opened it and withdrew the document that had been the subject of so much pain and triumph. She walked up to the horse and held it up. "This is 160 acres of deeded land," she said firmly. "Purchased with gold. Taxes paid in full to the territory office in Helena, and the title upheld by Judge Thaddeus Black in the court of Bitter Creek just 2 months ago." Sterling took the paper, adjusting his spectacles. He read it in silence. He looked at the seal. He looked at the signature. He looked back at the map. "This complicates things," Sterling muttered. "It simplifies them," Clara corrected. "This is private property. If the Northern Pacific wishes to run a line through this valley, they will not do so by eviction. They will do so by negotiation. And I can assure you, Mr. Sterling, the price of this land is not cheap." Sterling looked at her. He saw the set of her jaw, the intelligence in her eyes, and the massive, silent man standing beside her who looked ready to dismantle the railroad tie by tie. He handed the deed back. "I see," Sterling said, his tone shifting to one of grudging respect. "I will have to note this in my report. We may have to route the grade to the south, across the river. It would be more expensive." "That is a matter for your company," Clara said pleasantly. But you will not lay a single tie on this side of the water without our permission. Do we understand each other?" Sterling tipped his hat. "We do, ma'am." He signaled to his men. They turned their horses and rode back down the trail, heading toward the river crossing. Elias watched them go. He let out a long breath. "You sent the railroad packing," he said, shaking his head in wonder. "I would have just shot their hats off." Clara tucked the deed back into the box. "Shooting hats creates enemies. Elias, the law creates boundaries. And this land, nobody takes this land from us. Not a preacher, not a trapper, and certainly not a railroad." Elias looked at her, and the pride on his face was brighter than the autumn sun. As the season deepened, the validation of their life came not just from surveyors, but from the town itself. The arrest of Malachi Ford had broken a dam in Bitter Creek. The fear he had cultivated evaporated, and, in its place, a tentative curiosity about the woman who had stood up to him began to bloom. Clara rode into town one Tuesday to trade for winter flour and coffee. She expected the usual silence. Instead, as she tied Bess to the rail, Mrs. Gable, the woman who had testified in the church, stepped out of the bakery. "Mrs. Boone," the woman called out, using the name the town had assumed, though they had not yet spoken vows. Clara turned. "Mrs. Gable." The older woman wiped her flour-dusted hands on her apron. "I have a child at home with a chest cough. The doctor is drunk again. I recall hearing your father was a learned man. Do you know of anything for the lungs?" Clara hesitated, then softened. "Pine needle tea," she said. "Steep it with honey and a little wild sage. It breaks the congestion." Mrs. Gable nodded, her eyes wet. "Thank you. And thank you for what you did, for speaking up. We were all so afraid. You gave us our voices back." Other women began to stop her. They asked about the garden she had planted in the rocky soil. They asked how she kept the heat in the cabin during the blizzards. They did not look at her as a fallen woman anymore. They looked at her as a survivor, as someone who had tamed the wild not by conquering it, but by enduring it. Clara rode back up the mountain that evening with a lightness in her chest she had never known. She was not just tolerating the world. She was part of it, on her own terms. The first snow of the season was forecasted for late November. The sky turned a heavy, slate gray, and the temperature plummeted, freezing the river edges into lace. On the eve of the storm, the cabin was warm and bright. The new room was finished. The fire roared on the stove. Elias and Clara sat by the hearth, cleaning their tools. Elias set down the oil rag he was using on his rifle. He reached into his pocket. "Clara," he said. She looked up. He was nervous. This man, who could face down a grizzly bear without blinking, was trembling. He held out his hand. In his palm sat a ring. It was not gold. It was not silver. It was carved from the antler of an elk, polished until it shone like ivory. It was simple, a perfect circle, but etched into the surface were tiny, delicate lines, mountains, trees, a winding river. It was the story of their valley, carved in bone. "I have nothing of value to give you," Elias said, his voice rough. "I spent my gold to buy the debt. I have no family inheritance. I have only my hands and this land." Clara reached out and took the ring. It was warm from his pocket. "I carved it," he continued, looking at the floor. "It took me all summer. I wanted you to have something that lasts." He took a breath and looked her in the eye. "I never thought I would belong to anyone. Clara, I thought I was too broken. I thought my life ended the day I burned that house down. But you gave me back my life. You made me want to be a man again, not just a ghost." He paused, his throat working. "I want you to wear this, as my wife. If you will have me." Clara looked at the ring, tracing the tiny carvings with her thumb. She looked at the mountains he had etched, the same mountains that loomed outside their window. She looked at Elias, seeing the scars on his face and the love in his eyes. She slipped the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly. She reached out and took his hands, pulling him closer until their knees touched. "I will wear it," she said softly. and I will be your wife." Elias let out a shuddering breath and leaned his forehead against hers. "I belong to you." "Clara." Clara pulled back slightly, lifting his chin so she could look into his eyes. "No." "Elias." He frowned, confused. "We do not belong to each other," she said firmly. "To be owned is to be property. I was owned by my father's debt. I was owned by the auction block. I will never be owned again." She kissed the scar on his temple. "We chose each other," she whispered. "Every day, when the sun shines and when the snow buries us, we choose to stay. We choose to love. That is stronger than belonging." "Elias, that is freedom." Elias looked at her, the truth of her words settling over him. He nodded slowly. "We choose," he repeated. The next morning, the world was holding its breath. The sky was a white sheet, heavy and low. The first flakes were beginning to drift down, large and silent. "Come," Clara said, grabbing her heavy wool coat, the one Elias had made for her. "Where?" "Up." They walked out of the cabin, leaving the warmth behind. They hiked up the ridge behind the homestead, their boots crunching on the frozen earth. They climbed past the tree line, up to a high rocky outcrop that overlooked the entire valley. From here, they could see everything. They could see the cabin, small and sturdy, smoke curling from its chimney. They could see the garden, now put to bed under a layer of straw. They could see the river, winding like a dark ribbon through the gray landscape. And beyond, they could see the town of Bitter Creek, tiny and insignificant against the vastness of the wilderness. The wind bit at their faces, cold and sharp. Clara wrapped her coat tighter around herself. Elias stepped up behind her, opening his own heavy buffalo coat and wrapping it around her, enclosing her in his warmth. They stood there for a long time, watching the snow begin to fall in earnest, blurring the lines between the earth and the sky. The mountains stretched out before them, harsh, wild, beautiful, and indifferent. They were mountains that could kill the unprepared, but they were also mountains that could heal the broken. Clara leaned back into Elias's chest, feeling the solid beat of his heart. She raised her hand, looking at the antler ring against the backdrop of the white peaks. "This is mine," she whispered into the wind. Elias rested his chin on the top of her head. "The land? No," she said. "Not just the land. This life, this peace, this love. It is mine. I fought for it. I bled for it, and I won it." Elias tightened his arms around her. "A man can live in the wild his whole life," he said, his voice rumbling against her back. "He can learn the trails. He can hunt the game. He can survive the storms. But it is just survival. It is just breathing." He turned her around so he could look at her face, snowflakes catching in his beard and on her eyelashes. "It takes a woman to make it home," he said. Clara smiled, and it was a smile that contained the summer sun, even in the teeth of winter. "Let us go home. Elias, the snow is falling." They turned and began the descent. The snow was coming down harder now, erasing their footprints as soon as they made them, washing the world clean. They did not walk single file, with him leading and her following. They walked side by side. They walked past the frozen pines. They walked toward the cabin where the fire was waiting. They walked into the winter not with fear, but with the fierce, unshakable joy of those who have looked into the abyss and chosen the light. They were survivors. They were lovers. And for the first time in their lives, they were truly, completely free. Thank you for journeying with me through the snow, the heartache, and the redemption of Clara and Elias. This story has been a testament to the idea that love is not just a feeling, but a choice made in the face of harsh realities. I hope the winds of the Montana high country felt as real to you as they did to me while writing. I would love to hear from you. Where are you listening or reading from today? Please leave a comment below sharing your location and your thoughts on the story. Did Clara's strength resonate with you? Did Elias's redemption touch your heart? If you enjoyed this tale, please consider subscribing to From Wild West for more stories of grit, grace, and love on the American frontier. Until next time, keep your fires burning and your powder dry.